when you walk with open arms towards the sun, you feel the warmth of the rays, and then you know you're alive, and you don't have to be afraid of anything, cause you know the truth, and the truth is love, yes it is, wasn't what they said to you.
Welcome to the Bassline. Dr. Stephen Pelech is a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. He is also a founding member of the Biomedical Research Center at UBC. He has authored over 280 scientific publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals and books. It is my privilege to welcome to the Bassline the prolific Dr. Stephen Pelech. Welcome to the Bassline, Dr. Pelech. How's the weather in British Columbia today?
Hi, Jeremiah. The weather is sunny, but the traffic is bad with construction.
Okay.
But otherwise, it's a beautiful day here in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Oh, that's nice to hear. So, we want to get right into this lively discussion. I'm really thankful that you're taking the time to join us here today. And I would like to start out with a sort of a general overview of how you would describe the state of British Columbia specifically, but Canada as a nation in general in the post-COVID era. Because I'll just say, and I've mentioned similar sentiments on this program before, as an American, I always had it in the back of my mind, and I'm not the only one, that if things got a little crazy in America, we could just go up to that more rational, calm place that's Canada. And then COVID hit, and it seemed like all sorts of draconian measures were being implemented in Canada, to the extent that I would say, you know what, if you want to escape from the United States, you're probably better off going south than north at this point. So what is going on in Canada right now from your perspective, and how has the COVID event, as I call it, has that changed the landscape?
Well, I have to say that we did not learn the lessons from COVID in Canada with respect to the measures that were made by the provincial and the federal governments when it came to COVID mandates. We can certainly see the situation has not improved. I'm based in British Columbia, and we have a party that's running the country for the province for the last over 11 years, which is a bit more like your, I guess, a Democratic Party. It's actually called the New Democratic Party here in British Columbia. And they've introduced a number of measures that actually have really seriously affected our population. One of the measures was to recognize the United Nations for Indigenous peoples, we call it DRIPA, and what the consequence of that has been is that most of the property or land in our province is now considered or under dispute as being owned by our Indigenous population. And so that has caused quite a havoc, because a lot of people that thought they owned their properties, it turns out that First Nations has a claim on it that overrides their own private, purchase of the land. So that's one problem. And then I've been more involved myself recently with a case of where a farm had an outbreak. This was an ostrich farm, had an outbreak of the H5N1 virus. And basically it was a standoff going through the court system for about 10 months. The birds ended up being extremely healthy, but in the end, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency massacred all the birds, even though they were very healthy. There's about 430 of these birds. So going through the court system, because I was an expert witness, it became quite apparent that these are very draconian measures that were being applied. And it shows you in British Columbia, not only do you not necessarily have property rights, but even what you have on that property, the government can come in with relatively little justification and basically seize or destroy your assets. So that's where we're at, kind of in a nutshell, here in British Columbia.
Right. So you led me into my second question there, which is about the ostrich farm, but since you mentioned it already, let me be a little bit more specific in terms of I've followed the case of the ostrich farm somewhat. It's very distressing to see this sort of senseless slaughtering of these beautiful animals. But I did host an X Space several months ago that got a little bit testy, I guess you could say. And there was someone who came into the space. I won't try to recapitulate the whole discussion, but there was someone basically placing blame on the ostrich farm itself, which was sort of a new twist in my understanding of the situation, because I visualized that the ostrich farm was just trying to protect the ostriches and they were just victims of the situation. I don't know that that's wrong, but this person was claiming that this farm had signed an agreement with the government, and it was known the ostriches would be slaughtered, and basically accusing the farm of not being completely forthright in their agreement with the government. What's your take on that claim?
Well, that's crazy. That's why he went to court in the first place. And, you know, I think the situation, just a brief synopsis, I mean, basically these farmers, they had about 450 ostriches. And in December and the beginning of January of 2025 and the end of 2024, what they had was about 69 of the birds had died. And they didn't know what it was from. They thought it was Pseudomonas. This is a bacterial infection. And prior to that, they did have an infection with Pseudomonas. Pardon?
No, I didn't say anything. I'm just listening.
Oh, sorry. I just hear a lot of crackle.
Oh, really? I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. It's like another person on the line. So what happened was these birds, they died. A neighbor noticed that some of the birds had died. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency came in. They had tested the birds for H5. It's one of the proteins in the virus. And on that basis alone, what they did was they issued a call order 41 minutes after this positive test came in. And then since then, the farmers have tried to go to the courts. I was an expert witness in the case, so I'm fully aware of what happened there and also what the Canadian Food Inspection Agency claims were. And one of the things that in an upshot, basically the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA for short, ruled that these ostriches were going to be a source of the next pandemic of H5N1 in the human population, that they were going to be, even if they looked like they were healthy, they were shedding virus. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency wouldn't allow anyone to test the birds to see, in fact, if they were still infected after they recovered. During the course of 10 months, where we had court cases going to various levels of court, the Supreme Court of Canada decided not to hear the case. But immediately after that ruling came through, they were actually already the CFIA and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They had typically 50 police on site at the time, because there was a group of supporters that had been coming to watch the farm ever since this started. But on this day, November the 6th, when it got dark, the lights came on to blind anybody who was seeing what was going on. They had sharpshooters that shot these birds. There was over 1,000 rounds and then it stopped after a couple hours. And then the next day in the morning, when there was light, they could see that some of the birds are still alive, and then they shot the remaining birds. So the carcasses were kind of put into a truck and then sent all down from central British Columbia, a long ways down to the lower mainland here where Vancouver is. And they were there for about a week in these trucks, and then eventually they went to some sort of landfill somewhere, which was not disclosed. But the CFIA is basically claiming that these birds were going to be the source of a new H5N1 pandemic. And I had actually tested the birds myself, not the birds after they've been infected, but from eggs from those birds recovered from the summer before, and I could confirm that they had actually antibodies against the H5N1 virus, which means that they had a certain degree of protection already. And this could account for why in the total herd, there was only about 15% casualties over the course of the 11 months that they had been first infected. And when you have a high pathogenicity avian influenza virus, H5N1, you expect about 75% at least, typically 85% death of an infected flock. So in Canada, we've had over 650 outbreaks of H5N1 across the country over the last few years. It's resulted in the call of 17.3 million chickens and ducks and other birds. In the United States, you've had over 200 million chickens that have actually been, and other fowl that are domestic, that have been actually called using a stamping out policy. And this allows actually trade of the poultry products across to other countries. So we have these agreements in Canada and the United States and other countries. But during this entire time, when we've had this virus in the wild bird population, spreading it to the farms, including dairy farms, there's over 1,000 dairy farms that have actually been infected in the United States. We don't kill the cows, but we do kill the birds and ducks that are domestic. And it's clear that the culling policy really does not reduce the incidence of this because the virus is actually in the wild bird population. The good news is it seems as though the virus is mutating to a form which, while it is still very, very infectious, and not necessarily very infectious from a bird to a mammal, it happens, but the virus does not cause the disease very easily in mammals and humans, obviously. I think there's been about 71 cases in the last few years across both Canada and United States combined. There's about 2 lethalities. I think there were 2 65-year-old males that had chickens in their backyard. They also had comorbidities, and so they died. Most people don't usually die from influenza. They die from secondary infection. In humans, typically pneumonia. In birds, typically Pseudomonas. So it's not the source of a major pandemic that we would ever expect. The H5N1 virus has been documented for over 65 years, and we've never had anything close to a pandemic with this particular strain. In humans, it's more the H1, H2, and H3 influenza strains that cause the human illness, not the H5 or the H7, which are more common in birds. So a little long-winded, but that kind of, I hope, explains the situation. There was really never any threat to these birds on the ostrich farm in British Columbia. It did not affect trade between the United States and Canada. About 70% of our trade here in Canada is to the United States. The Food Inspection Agency is the first to admit that if you eat products that are from poultry or even cows that have been infected, and even the milk, if the milk's pasteurized, if the food's cooked, there's absolutely no threat from H5N1 in a human population for consumption.
Right. So with such a weak scientific basis for such an aggressive action by the government, what, in your estimation, is the real motivation for these actions? What are they doing with this just brutal
well, that's a very
slaughter?
good question. You know, the World Organization for Animal Health, which involves many different health-related, for animal health-related agencies, like I say, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency here in Canada was involved in this organization. They came up with the guidelines for stamping out. Now, the thing about stamping out policy is the World Organization for Animal Health, they actually give you two options. One option is that if you have an outbreak in a zone, then, and you may have several zones in a country, the Universal Ostrich Farms was actually in its own zone. So trade from that zone is restricted. Now, if you have an outbreak and you do the culling policy, you kill all the birds that are in contact with the tested bird, then after 1 month, if there's no further outbreak, then you regain your disease-free status for trade. In fact, prior to the more lethal H5N1 in the birds in the last few years, the policy was 3 months. If you had no recovery, so you had no outbreaks in 3 months, then you have disease-free status. So as we have a more dangerous virus in the wild bird population, we actually reduced the period that you had to have no outbreaks. Now, that's one option. The second option is that if you let it burn out, that means if you let the virus actually kill the animals that are susceptible and the remaining animals recover, they develop an immune response, and that will protect them against future infections. Then if you have no outbreaks in a year's period, 1 year, then you also regain disease-free status. So for these ostriches, they went 10 months with no signs of any disease. They had fully recovered by the middle of January 2025. If they had been 2 more months, then they would have had disease-free status, according to the World Organization for Animal Health and traded products that are poultry products. And the day after the call happened, there was 2 more outbreaks in British Columbia, which basically nullified any kind of ability to become disease-free in the whole province. And in fact, there was about 40 outbreaks during that entire period of time. So it really had no bearing on the trade of poultry products between Canada, the United States, and most other countries. So it's a weak argument that was presented by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency why it was so critical to call these birds in order to not jeopardize international trade. And then the other thing, too, is when you have an outbreak on a farm, it is possible for people to pick up an infection and develop antibodies. Most of the time, you have no symptoms. But it's very difficult if you have a farm that's been contaminated, for the birds to actually contaminate adjacent farms. The way that those adjacent farms, if so, would have to be from wild bird exposure. So the threat of this actually spreading from a farm is pretty low. The cases where we have those, 71 cases recorded of H5N1 in people are people that were involved in calling the farms that had been infected. And in fact, there was more of those people got infected from the dairy farms than from the poultry farms. So so I don't really think it was that likely for a transmission. And in fact, for H5N1, there's never been a reported case of a transmission from a person who had H5N1 to another person. So the risk was very, very minimal.
Right.
And you have to also remember that when you have these migratory wild birds flying across Canada and the United States on their migratory paths, now they're landing in parks and schoolyards and recreation areas, and they're defecating everywhere. And we don't have a large incidence of H5N1 in the human population. This, again, is why the risk of that kind of transmission, especially on this farm in the middle of nowhere with flightless birds, was kind of a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah, it seems to be tied into a larger biosecurity agenda.
Yes. Yeah, and that doesn't bode well for animals.
Right.
in the case of biosecurity, they were concerned that these ostriches were running around on fields in pens, very large pens, where wild birds can come in and try to eat their food too. And so the scenario is that even though historically we've had farms or animals are able to roam around the land, we're now concerned that these animals could be contained in sealed units that off from natural environment, crowded, and of course it's not surprising that if you do get an infection in a population like that, so enclosed in high concentration, that the virus would be able to spread very, very quickly. So, and of course, when you cull all the animals, you don't allow the development of natural immunity, and you don't select for genetics in these animals that might make them less susceptible in the future to being infected. So it actually keeps your herd populations genetically not predisposed, perhaps, but certainly immunologically naive. That is, they had never been exposed to the virus before, and they're very likely, if they do get infected, to have a poor outcome.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you're an author. I know you have a forthcoming book about the ostrich farm situation. And what can you tell us about the already published books, Down the COVID Rabbit Hole, as well as COVID-19 Pandemonium, two interesting titles? What can you give us an overview of both of those, please?
The COVID-19 Rabbit Hole book was really about the science of COVID. We examined, first we had some chapters in there that kind of explained viruses and explained immunology and how, in order for a virus to actually cause disease, what are the steps that are necessary. And then we went into the vaccines and looked at how do those vaccines work or not work, as it turns out. And then there's a lot of material there in terms of their testing, which if people were really aware of how poorly they were tested before they were approved, here in Canada, it was very similar to the United States, they only had about 2 months of phase 3 human trials before they actually approved the virus for use in the wide population. And so there was no long-term or even mid-term efficacy or safety data when these vaccines, the genetic vaccines, were the first time they ever really used these. So they were given to the entire population. And so we get into that. In the second book, COVID-19 Pandemonium, we looked more at the politics. We explored where the virus actually originated. I think it's pretty convincing that it was a probably accidental release of a genetically engineered virus that combined aspects of the SARS-CoV-1 virus with a bat virus that had been recovered and taken to the the Wuhan Institute for Virology. And then we get into, well, how did the media respond? How did the courts respond? How did the universities and other facets of the institutions in our country and your country, how they're essentially captured to present a narrative, and to also avoid people from considering alternatives that, in fact, may have been actually quite effective. I'm talking about things like ivermectin, for example. But instead, pushing things like, wearing the masks and doing, in addition to the mandatory vaccinations that we had in Canada, some of the other measures, lockdowns, closing down churches, but meanwhile having big box stores open where everybody had to go through one door. I mean, there's someone who studies immunology and sees how these particular measures were introduced with very little rationale, frankly. I mean, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is about 0.15 microns in size, but an N95 mask it has pore sizes that are on average about 35 microns. So virus is 0.15 microns. The holes in the mask are 35 microns in that range. So it's like using a chain link fence to keep out mosquitoes.
Right.
So the mask doesn't actually even work. And so what ends up happening is you have a population, even today in Canada, and I see it in Vancouver, we still have people walking around outdoors by themselves wearing masks because the population is so traumatized and they trust, what the health authorities sit on these things. And meanwhile, they're depriving themselves of oxygen and increasing the rebreathing their CO2 and actually causing physical damage, increased acne and other problems associated with long-term mask wearing. So,
yeah, don't get me started about the masks. I still see people, unfortunately, right here in New York City wearing masks. And, it's so sad to me. Doesn't
work for that.
Yeah, not at all. To me, it's such a strange thing to just arbitrarily decide something is a filter. My analogy is like, and I've used this before on this program, is like if I invited you over and I offered you a glass of water and then I started pouring your water through a sock and you said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm filtering your water. Just grab an object and arbitrarily decide. It's a filtration system.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not only that, but it's a great system for incubating bacteria that do get trapped in the mask. The warm temperature, the moisture, and all that. That's why you have increased risks of acne.
Yeah.
But I never thought I'd see the day when you go into a bank and you're invited to wear a mask, and the tellers are wearing masks.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That's funny. And then, of course, there was the Cochrane study that just completely annihilated any claim that there was any benefit to these things whatsoever. I want to pause.
That's correct. It was known before then, and then they did that study again with this meta-analysis.
Right.
And there was a lot of problems because the journal that published it got a lot of pushback. But in the end, they had to admit this is what the studies showed.
Right. Yeah, it's strange how people tried to infuse their own personal feelings in what's supposed to be a science discussion.
Well, I think one of the other things that's very revealing was the study with the Cleveland Clinic. They had about 51,000 healthcare workers. They tracked them for a 6-month period on whether their vaccinations for COVID-19 was actually offering protection against future infections. And what they found in that, again, 51,000 healthcare workers, the ones that were the unvaccinated had the lowest rates of subsequent infection again. And if they got one shot, they had an increased rate. If they got 2 shots, it was even higher. If it was 3 shots, it was higher. And 4 shots was the highest. The more that they were vaccinated, the more likely they were actually going to get COVID-19. And the mechanisms for this are actually quite easy to explain because we now also know from numerous studies, and by the way, the Cleveland Clinic results were reproduced by other studies too, is that you have a switch in the type of antibodies that you produce against, in this case, the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the protein that's produced through the vaccines by your own body cells in uncontrolled amounts. So what ends up happening is you initially produce antibodies that are what we call IG1 and IG3 class antibodies. And these antibodies actually are what we call pro-inflammatory. They're more likely to attack the virus and cells that have been infected by the virus, which is what you want. But after you get booster shots, you actually get a switch in the type of antibodies you produce to IG4 antibodies and IG2 antibodies. And these are anti-inflammatory antibodies. That means that when the antigen comes in this case the spike protein, that these viruses, they bind and they interfere with the rest of the immune system to actually take out the virus. They actually downregulate your immune response to, in this case, a spike protein. So if you get the virus infects you again, your immune system has actually become tolerized to the infection. And the more you get these booster shots, the more tolerized you are, and the more likely, if you get reinfected, that you're going to get sick. And so it's the exact opposite of what we were desiring, that you'd have increased protection. You're actually reducing your protection.
Wow. Yeah.
So that explains a lot of the data that we're seeing.
Right. Yeah, I'm no biologist. I make that perfectly clear. Not a biologist, not a scientist of any kind, not a medical professional. But what you're saying seems to remind me of some of the warnings of Dr. Gert van den Bosch.
Yeah, he was talking about weak antibodies that are produced. I don't necessarily agree with what he had to say. I think if you have natural infection, you're getting the whole virus, you're getting a full immune response. And as you naturally encounter the virus again, you actually boost your immune system naturally. And that's why you don't need to have repeated injections. Well, let me put it this way. When you get a typical vaccination, you're getting usually a live but attenuated, weakened version of a virus. You're getting maybe a few hundred to a few thousand copies of that virus. And that's sufficient to give you a good immune response that will protect you against that particular pathogen in the future. But when you were taking these genetic vaccines, like the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, you were getting hundreds of trillions of lipid nanoparticles in each injection. Now, a lipid nanoparticle is the same size as a virus, but it has 5 to 10 copies of the gene to make the spike protein. So when those lipid nanoparticles enter into the cells of your body, and they're not specific, they'll enter any cells of your body, then your own body cells take that mRNA that comes in and uses it as a blueprint to make the spike protein, which is then produced on the surface of your own cells. It's presented there. And in order for your immune system to mount a response to develop antibodies against that protein, or to educate what we call T immune cells to recognize cells that have been infected with the virus and are having that protein on their surface, you have to have the immune system attack those cells and actually often kill those cells in order to then develop the immune response. So the next time when you get reboosted, your immune system is already stimulated to recognize that spike protein, and so the immune attack is even stronger the second time. And of course, the cells have to try, the immune system has to try to balance between protecting you against a pathogen, but if your antibody levels are really, really high, you end up also having those antibodies attack other cells, collateral damage. So there's a fine axe, it's a double-edged sword. You want a good immune response, but you don't want that immune response to be so great that you start to developing autoimmune diseases. And so this is the problem. There's never been a scenario, to my knowledge, in nature where you're introducing such a large amount of antigen as would be produced with the spike protein from the vaccines. Your immune system is not evolved for that situation. So, for example, you do not make antibodies against your own proteins in your body. You don't make it against your food generally. You don't make it against pollen and other things that are in the environment unless you develop allergies. Most people will not do that because their immune system gets educated from early in life to recognize what's foreign and what's unusual. But if you're starting to give these large amounts of antigen, your immune system thinks, oh, this is okay. And if you're getting it on a repeated period, you think, oh, maybe it's a seasonal. And it's developing these anti-inflammatory antibodies and down-regulating the responses that you would want to a pathogen that's actually disease causing. So this is the problem.
Right. Well, thank you for that detailed explanation. I want to pause briefly because we're more than halfway through our program, and I want to first of all encourage you, if you're listening and you want to join the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. The number here, of course, is 888-874-4888, 888-874-4888 if you have a question for Dr. Stephen Pelech. And I want to mention a few ways that you can support this program. First of all, April 26th is the next 5 to 8 jam session in Harlem. Please join us at Rock Mill Fitness. That's 274 Lenox Avenue. It's just south of 124th Street, and the doors are 3:30 p.m. And Rock Mill is just a wonderful place. We've had a great time at these jam sessions. So please come through and meet me and meet other conscientious people, and it's going to be a great time, guaranteed. April 26th, 3:30 p.m., which is a Sunday at Rock Mill Fitness. Frontierfarm.com. That's farm with a PH, FRONTIERPHARM.com. And the discount code is the Bassline, capital THE space BASSLINE. And you will be treated to a considerable discount. And they are the leading distributors of chlorine dioxide products, which I think are actually really exceptional. Skin care, oral hygiene, wound care, and an array of things that you should take a look at in terms of having some good prophylactics on hand. Also, privateiptvaccess.com. Incredible television system. You can watch news, sports, whatever you like from all around the world. If you have roots in another country, you can watch television from your native land. It's all available at an incredibly good rate, incredibly good deal at privateiptvaccess.com. The code there is Hosea, capital J, capital HOSEA. Of course, you can check out my music at jeremiahhosea.com, including the theme song of this show, Love's the Highest Truth. And I'm a chess teacher. RemoteLearningChess.com is my company. Please contact me for a lesson. Please sign up a loved one in your family for chess lessons. And if you know of any homeschooling networks, please connect me with them, because I've done some work with homeschoolers, but I'd really like to be more involved in that movement. So please make them aware of me as a resource. I'm a very experienced chess coach. I've been teaching the game for over 20 years now. And also, of course, Substack, jeremiahhosea.substack.com. I am working on a new article that will be published just in a matter of days. And yeah, that's where you get to see me express myself a little bit more extensively, and you can kind of get a feel for where I'm coming from as a person, as a journalist. And yeah, like once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, the number is 888-874-4888. Give us a call. But Dr. Pelech, I would love to, well, I don't want to say love to. It's actually with regret that I have to ask you this question, but in terms of an ongoing discussion on this program, we're trying to monitor just sort of the effects of the COVID injections. And that's sort of the theme of my forthcoming article, which I think is going to have to be a series as I'm working it out, just called Circles, I think is the name of the series. And the reason why I say circles is because if I look at every circle that my life is connected with, it seems like things have gone wrong since the COVID vaccine rollout. From my own family to the martial arts community I'm a part of, to the musicians community I'm a part of here in New York City, to any number of groups. If I look at the group, someone maybe died suddenly, someone now has a heart condition, someone else has a kidney issue, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems that, all statistics and data collection aside, if I just look anecdotally, something has clearly gone wrong from my point of view since the rollout of what I call the killer vaccines. What have you observed in terms of the effects of these vaccines in your own personal life, perhaps, but just in society?
Well, I think, a lot of the vaccines that are out there that have been used, like for influenza, the traditional vaccines, I think to a large extent they're pretty safe. Now, that is a little bit of concern with the use of adjuvants like aluminum, whether this may have some basis for increased, for example, autism. We certainly have increased rates of autism in our society. That is, I think, when I was in school as a kid, it was very rare to see this. Now we have about 1 in 30 children that are in schools that have some form of autism. So there is a lot of things going on in our society. It's hard to necessarily correlate these with the vaccinations. This is the first thing that I think someone who's doing epidemiology studies will recognize, that when you have something happening, it's very hard to correlate that necessarily with one particular cause. We do have a lot of problems in our society with the diet that many people are having, the stresses that they're being exposed to, the increased use of drugs. There's just a number of factors that are happening in parallel that probably contribute to the perfect storm for what we're seeing now. You're observing amongst friends and family what appears to be increased amounts of disease and death. Statistically, this is borne out. We are seeing increased rates of cancer, for example, that have followed not the first year of the pandemic, but the second year once the vaccine started for COVID-19. And that seems to be continuing to increase. And we're seeing other diseases that are also showing this, what we call increased excess mortality, more than what we would expect when you plot the data of the number of deaths that occur from different diseases as a consequence, over time. We are seeing these increased rates that happened right after the vaccine started. So there's a correlation, but there may be other explanations happening in parallel. The other thing, too, is, Jeremiah, we're getting older, and more of our friends are getting older and family, and it is natural that many of them will normally have died from many diseases that are available. One of the big interesting things in Canada, which is very different from the situation in the United States, is that as we have people that are developing these diseases and getting terminal diseases, we have what's called medical assistance in dying. We call it MAID for short. This is actually a book that I'm involved in writing as well. But in Canada, we started off with if a person was very ill and presumably suffering, there was no chance that they were going to recover from this disease, then we allow medical assistance in death. Then the next step was, well, you didn't have to necessarily have a terminal disease, but the disease was causing so much discomfort, for example, something like multiple sclerosis, that we would allow you to also have doctor-assisted death. And this requires in Canada two physicians or nurses or doctors that approve that this individual, and there used to be a cooling off period to reverse the decision, but you can do within 24 hours. And if one person says that they think that you're appropriate for this, it's very rare that the second person would argue against that. Or you just go to another doctor who would would agree to do it. Where it's getting really difficult in Canada is we have a moratorium for a short period of time. It keeps getting postponed. But if you're under 18, you can ask for MAID. And if you have, a mental illness, which is where, typically you have depression and you feel suicidal, which is one of the signs of depression, this will now also be considered appropriate. So we have about 5-6% of our population that dies that choose to have death this way. And one of the reasons why we're writing this book is because we also have a major organ transplantation happening where Canada is the major supplier of organs internationally.
Wow.
Now, we're not a very large country population-wise, and yet we are the major exporters of organs. And it turns out that we actually sell these organs as part of this.
Gruesome.
So there's a parallel happening between encouraging people to die and to then get their organs so they can be used in the transplantation industry.
Wow.
And as it turns out, there's a lot of pressure on families when they're facing this kind of situation. They'll take the patient who's dying potentially and tell them that, you don't want your family to worry and to burden them with this. And then they go to the family separately and they say, this person is suffering. You don't want them to suffer, so let them go. So it turns out there's a very high degree of pressure that's exerted on both the families and the people who are contemplating this. And then it also turns out that the actual process, the chemicals that are used, they actually have a lot of problems as well. So it's not necessarily a peaceful death. The average person takes about 9 minutes after all of the injections, but it can go for as long as 2 hours. And a quarter of the people that have MAID, it takes an hour at least.
Wow.
So it's they're not given, less than 1% of them actually get painkillers.
Oh my goodness.
So if some of the injections actually do induce pain, but they're also given a paralytic, so you will know that they're actually in pain. They're supposed to be anesthetized, so they're asleep, but we don't actually know how these drugs work in this scenario. We know that dreaming can happen under anesthesia, and in your dreams you're also still responsive to external stimuli as well. So it's not really clear what happens when we induce death in many of these people.
Yeah.
That it's the process that we had hoped for.
Yeah. Terrible. So I'd like to quickly encourage my listeners to check out my latest Substack article, which is just called The Bassline. And one good thing about that article as a resource is it has a list of all of my interviews. So you can scroll through that and you can copy and paste the links and listen to particular interviews. And I refer you back to my 2 interviews with Nurse Helena Krizek, as well as my interview with Dr. Paul Byrne on the subject of organ harvesting and that whole industry, which I didn't realize was happening out of Canada so extensively. That was quite a bit of important information you just shared with us. We have a couple of callers on the line, and we'd like to talk right now to DJ. How are you doing, DJ? Thanks for calling.
Doing good, Jamal. Thanks for having me. I just have a couple of quick questions. Right now, several family members took the shot and coming down with cancer now, and the other problems seem to be hitting with the eye. Now, as far as the cancer, is the SV40 playing a part in the cancer?
Yeah. So I think I think I understood your questions because it's a bit quiet for me. But the SV40 promoter, it's an enhancer promoter, was in the Pfizer vaccine with a genetic material to induce the increased production of the spike protein MR inside the cells. Now, it's not the virus; it's a portion of the virus. It's a portion that allows the genetic material, in theory, could go to the nucleus. It is possible that you can take the mRNA and make a DNA copy, and that DNA copy could then integrate into the genome. And if the integration is upfront of genes involved in cancer, oncogenes or tumor suppressor genes, in principle, you might be able to get increased rates of cancer. I think the probability of this is actually fairly low. If it does happen, it's not a major cause. I think the major effect of the vaccine is to disrupt the immune system in its regulation. And it diverts the resources of the immune system from attacking, while it's attacking the virus, it's not doing its job to attack cancer cells in the body. And so you have increased rates of these cancer cells growing because the immune system is probably distracted. And so this is where that's one of the mechanisms. There's actually many proposed mechanisms for why you could get increased rates of cancer from these kind of vaccines. I don't think the SV40 was an inducer promoter. It's a very small chunk. It's 72 base pairs long. I don't think that it's likely to be causing most of the cancers that we're seeing in the population itself.
Okay. And what about the eyes? Because some people I know have visual problems.
The eye is actually a real problem. My own stepmother, she got her second vaccine. She had a problem with her eye. It filled up with fluid, causing lots of pain. They had to put holes in the eye to drain the fluid. And then because she was in a extended care facility that required all people get vaccinated, she went and got vaccinated again, and she ended up having, within a couple of days, a similar problem. Couldn't see very well. It was swollen. It was painful, and they wanted to do an operation on her, and so she had to go off her blood thinners because they don't. And when you're doing the operation, you don't want excess bleeding. It needs to clot, and so she ended up about a week after that getting a blood clot that got into her carotid artery and actually caused her to be completely stroked, like a stroke on half of her body. Couldn't use her hands or her legs on one side, and then she died just a couple of days after that.
Wow.
So I've talked to a lot of people that are opticians. There does seem to be this higher incidence of eye problems after vaccines as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I direct the listeners to my interview with Dr. Seema Nanda, who is an eye doctor who covered this in detail. But we only have a few minutes, and I want to get to our next caller, which is my friend Ronald F. Owens Jr., I believe, is on the line. How are you, Ron? Thanks for calling. Ronald, are you there? I'm not sure what happened with Ronald. Yeah, Ronald, are you there? Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, I don't know. We're having a connection issue with Ronald somehow. But I want to mention tonight we are going to have the Bassline Extra on X. So please look me up at Earth Driver. And we host spaces on a nightly basis. The community is called End All Tyranny. We have 525 members so far in about 2.5 months of existence. Please join our community. Lively discussions, great guests every night. and we'd love to have you join us. Ronald, are you there? Can you hear me now? Yeah, not sure what happened with Ronald. So we only have 2 minutes to go here, unfortunately. And I want to thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Pelech. Can you tell us the ways by which people can follow you, where they can find the books, and how people can keep up with your work?
Well, I'm one of the founders of the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance. It has a website which is cccalliance.ca. We're based in Canada, so cccalliance.ca. And that website, we have a lot of information that's there about COVID, but also many other important topics that relate to healthcare and public policy. And it's an open access website. We are doing a lot of work to try to take and apply science to looking health policy to make sure that we're making the right decisions on how to confront these diseases and to improve the health of individuals. And so we have, I'm the head of the scientific and medical advisory committee of that, and we meet weekly or bi-weekly to discuss all these topics, and then we produce articles and videos, and these are all available online at cccalliance.ca.
cccalliance.ca.
Yeah, 3 C's and then Alliance.
Okay, excellent. Are you on X by any chance, Dr. Pelech?
Pardon?
Are you on X?
No.
Oh, too bad, because, we'd love to have you join us on our X Spaces at some point, if not tonight.
I have done an interview on X, and I'm happy to speak with you and your audience again in the future.
Okay. Well, I'll send you a link. We have to wrap, unfortunately. It's 2 p.m. Can't cut into the next program. But I want to thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Pelech. You've been very informative, and I congratulate you on all of your extensive work, and keep it up. Seems that you're very intensive.
Thank you. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise. So everyone, have a wonderful weekend. Please join us on X tonight. End All Tyranny starts at 9 p.m. Look me up at EarthDriver on X. And everyone have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next week. Take care.